I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
Yeah, I thought we'd wait till next week to start our new book. I kind of felt sometimes changing gears midway class. It's kind of confusing. Plus, when we do the new book, I was asked by a few not to just simply read the book, because it's kind of boring for everyone when we just read it. So I've been trying to make a class out of it, but with my abilities, it's a bit more of a challenge than most maybe. But so I'm in the preparation period of those lessons. But as I said, I didn't want to switch gears. Plus, we had a few things that I wanted us to look at again in Thessalonians here, so I think we'll make a class of it all right. But we left off last week with the condemnation of the Thessalonians, and we're moving on now to instruction that Paul's given for godly living. And our first question, or only question, I guess, in this section was, how are the members of the church instructed to treat the overseers of the congregation, and why? Why are they to do that? So our passage was 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 12 and 13. Jeff, do you have that? I'll get you to read that, please.
But we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you, have charge over you in the Lord, and give you instruction, and that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Live in peace with one another.
Okay. So our question was, how were the members instructed to deal with the overseers and the elders? I guess we could say that. Who are the overseers? They're the elders, right? I will just point out the New King James has the word recognize, and of course I use the New American Standard. It has appreciate. But the original word for that was, Thayer says, is know. How are we to know? And the word know in the original meant, well, I won't tell you what it meant, or I'll answer all the question, won't it? So, Gord?
It's not only those that have charge over you, it's also those who labor, which means teachers, preachers, people who set up the communion.
Right.
They all should be appreciated, because if nobody volunteers to do this, it wouldn't get done.
Right. That's true. I'll bring up a thought along that lines at the end. But just speaking as far as the elders go, I guess I could follow Gord's train of thought. If the members at Thessalonica and at any Lord's church would always endeavor to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Remember that verse from Ephesians, our study in Ephesians 4 and 3? If we endeavor to do that, will things not be easier? But what about the elders, the overseers? If I give you the meanings of the word that know, maybe to get us, but like I say, it'll answer it for you. But originally that word know, Thayer says, meant to have regard for one, to cherish one, and pay attention to. So when we're speaking of the overseers, first of all, what is their job? Is their job to
Shepherd the flock.
right?
They have a huge responsibility, and if they don't do it according to word, they're held accountable. And the teachers
Good point, Gord.
are
Yeah,
accountable for their teachings.
yeah. And that's pressure, isn't it? That type. So Paul is trying to have the brethren to recognize, to esteem the elders, to be at peace with the overseers of the congregation, and be patient because their job is to exhort, to warn us, to comfort us, and we all ought to uphold one another as the occasion demands, shouldn't it? And this will, as far as I think, it'll simplify and lighten the task of the elders, wouldn't it, in their rulership position. It's not an easy job because in a lot of cases they have to dish out discipline, which is not an easy matter for any of us. But along with Gord's thought, it all should be motivated. Well, it brings up the thought, okay, here we are, and we don't have qualified men to be elders. So does that mean it's a free-for-all?
No.
Right, Jeremy. So what should our attitude be then?
Our attitude, well, should be first of all to grow to the point. I'm talking about personally, not
Right.
the numbers. For the men, especially, to grow, if possible, to become volatile.
Right,
That should be our first motivation. Is not to want to remain as Titus said, lacking. Because when you don't have elders, it's not like there's no work to be done, but you're doing it now with people who are not best exemplified. It's not that the men who are not elders are somehow defective.
right,
There could be one reason or another. There's unmarried people who would be elders if they were married and had faithful children, but they didn't get married. Well, yeah, they're not qualified to be an elder, but it doesn't mean that they're completely useless,
Yeah.
but they do not have the leadership experience that would come from having a family that you led to Christ as well. So,
right, exactly. But the fact of the matter is that we don't have elders, and I've often thought of this, then our attitude, it's almost like we need to pay attention more to the problems or to the work, because we don't have qualified men to do that. So which tells me then that we need to be motivated with a spirit which desires to see the best done in the progress of the gospel and the affairs of the Lord's church. you know, the elders, a lot of pressure on them, but I see more so than on a group of men. You know, our thinking should always be on what is best for the purpose that God has put the church here for.
When you think about it just from a practical standpoint, where, or like maybe a secular standpoint, you have, in any field you might have experts who are qualified, who have done the work that is necessary to attain the position they have. Now, if you don't have those people, it's not that the work cannot be done,
Right.
but as you said, it's going to require more effort because we don't have people who excel.
Yeah.
And so it is. It's not that the work is harder; it's different, and it's going to, like as far as it's going to include, when you even take a look at the men in a congregation, you have different stages of spiritual development.
Right.
And so you're going to have to deal with those types of issues. And in those types of issues, I would caution as well that we do need to lean on those who might have more experience. And it's not that we defer to them. It's not that they're the smartest people or they're the de facto elders. They're not. But because, especially those who are spiritually new to the faith, need to recognize, okay, those who are more experienced, just as the scriptures say, respect your elders, respect older members. Right? As far as those who are older, why? Because they're more experienced. So the youngers should be looking to the elders to give them the experience that when they get older, they're able to be elders. To understand what I mean.
Right. Yeah, it all goes along with our attitudes. The thought I had sometimes when you have a group of men, there's always the challenge of not having it my way or no way. And that takes effort on our part to work together and to examine ourselves, to not have that attitude, and to just remind ourselves that we're here for one purpose. And it's not only to worship God as His children, but for the furtherance of the gospel. I don't know, Jeff?
It's interesting in that section of the scripture that Paul finishes that with live in peace. Be at peace. Not just make a show of peace, but think differently. Live in peace. Why? Well, because we see in the world, say in business situations where people are together, or in family situations, people don't always appreciate being instructed or being corrected.
Right.
That often creates bad feelings. But we need to look at the big picture. It's not about whether my feelings are hurt or not, it's about what's true. I need to be instructed or corrected in something. I need to remember what brethren are doing, their work that they're doing, helping me. My own responsibility. And actually be in peace. Just pretend to have peace with other people. Live in peace.
Right. Exactly. It's a challenge, isn't it? Our natures constantly, why we need to examine ourselves. It's lots of times I speak with Tammy and she's a lot mellower, and I have the nature that, like a firecracker, I guess you could say, and we need to be careful. That's a constant challenge with us. And it's not only in men. but that always impresses upon me that that's not the attitude we should have as Christians.
And it should get us to appreciate the qualifications of elders.
Right.
Like, as far as when you think about it, why did God want the qualities of an elder to be what they are? Because of those issues.
Right.
Learning to recognize, okay, it's not my way or highway. It's learning to be level-headed and self-controlled and but all of those things are things that all Christians need to grow in. Those are difficult things sometimes, and we should, as a congregation, appreciate. Okay, we don't have elders,
Right.
but it would be like, as far as the qualifications of elders, if we have elders one day, we should appreciate that as well as the men who qualify for it.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's good thoughts for us. Well, that ends that question. Now, last week I had, I think it was last week, but when we were talking, you remember of Timothy, Paul being in Athens. And I did some more studying on that because later when I looked at what I had said, I thought, I don't know if that's the case. But in what I had said was Timothy and Silas remained in Berea, and at some point there, Timothy returned to Thessalonica because of Paul's worry for them, while Paul was in Athens alone. But in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 2, so I started out here, and then I went back. This is the letter that Paul wrote. And then I went back to the history in the book of Acts. But Paul says in chapter 3 and verse 2, therefore, when we could endure it no longer, we thought it best to be left behind at Athens alone. Now, what I thought was, from here, the construction of this passage seems that someone is sent from Athens. And I believe that was Timothy. He was there with them. But if we go back to Acts chapter 17, and we read in verse 14 and 15. Now this is there's no mention here of Timothy coming to Athens at all. And we read here in verse 14, then immediately the brethren sent Paul out to go as far as the sea, and Silas and Timothy remained there. Now those who escorted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they left. So Timothy and Silas are in Berea, and Paul is now in Athens and has asked the brethren to go back to Berea and tell Timothy and Silas to come to me. But when I read the chapter 3, there's no record in Acts of Timothy coming. But then we see Paul leaving Athens in Acts and going to Corinth, where he was joined by Silas and Timothy, and we read that in chapter 18 of Acts in verse 5. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. So what I thought was, how do I reconcile the Acts account with 1 Thessalonians 3 and verse 2? Therefore we could endure it no longer. We thought it best to be left behind at Athens alone. Seems Paul was there with someone, and now he's saying he wants to be left alone. And it's necessary then to suppose that Timothy had come to Athens, and it may be extremely probable that he did. But now we go back to Acts chapter 17 and verse 15. 17 and verse 15 we read, "Now those who escorted Paul brought him as far as Athens again and received the command for Timothy and Silas to come to him as soon as possible." So I'm thinking Paul's sent that message back, and we have no record of why they didn't come. And yet, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 and 2, we're left there with the impression, the probability that that request was obeyed. Sure?
I'm just throwing it
Yep.
out there.
Yeah.
I don't know.
The-
Sometimes we refer to we as sort of like a royal we. Sometimes we refer to ourselves as we. We
Right.
Not, we like as far as it's. I see where you come from.
Yeah,
I do. It is. I know with Acts 18 verse 5, Silas and Timothy, it seemed to me that Silas and Timothy, if Timothy went back, Silas did too.
right.
And then came and found Paul at Corinth if they did that. I wonder if in 1 Thessalonians he's using a royal we there. I don't know.
Right.
And it's interesting to think about.
Right. That's true. And also, it's pretty hard to find a couple writers that both had the same idea. But I also wondered if, therefore, when we couldn't endure it, whether that was Luke speaking. It's hard to say. But on the other hand, when Paul was in Athens, the purpose was that Timothy and Silas come to join him there. And we read that in verse 16 of Acts 17. Now Paul was waiting for them at Athens. His spirit was being provoked with him as he was observing the city full of idols. So Paul is in Athens and has that purpose. And we see that his departure from Athens wasn't rushed. He had opportunity to visit the city. If you look at verse 23 of Acts 17, "For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God, therefore what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you.'" The thought of examining. Paul wasn't in a big rush. He's touring around Athens. If you look at verse 17 of the same chapter, here we see him disputing in the synagogues and the market daily. So he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. And he held discussions with philosophers that we read in 2:22. Where he speaks with the Epicurean and the Stoic philosophers. Remember, and they took him to the Areopagus. They wanted to know more of his teaching. It's just the thought that Paul didn't rush into Athens and rush out of Athens. He was there for a while. He made converts there. We read that in verse 24. And then after all these things, he calmly went to Corinth. His life wasn't in danger at Athens. There was ample time, I think, then for Timothy to have come to him, and Paul sent him back to Macedonia, which now brings us to the verse we read in chapter 18 of Acts and 5, when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia. So it is hard to say, but I just thought I kind of said that he didn't come to Athens, and we're not given why he didn't come. Really, it's kind of hard to know that, you know. But he comes to him at Corinth instead of Athens, and Paul gives directions then for Timothy to come to him, and then sure?
Finish your thought.
Oh, and then he was sent back to Berea.
I said there's another thing to consider too, is the flow of Luke in the book of Acts. He's telling a narrative. He
Right.
said, well, he commanded Silas to come with all haste. Was that the only thing he commanded? Or is that the only thing Luke discussed? Because it's the flow of Luke's narrative, right?
Right.
Luke's not concerned so much with Silas and Timothy's journeys. He's following Paul's journey.
Right.
So there is another thing to consider. I can't say one way.
No.
But perhaps there's more to that command that we can glean from 1 Thessalonians than Luke portrayed in Acts, because that would have sort of maybe it wasn't important to his narrative. It's sort of like what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do. And certain things are important to certain gospel writers, while other things are sort of minimized and expanded. Like some expand, some minimize. It's not saying that something else happened. It's just what's the focus of whatever they're trying to do.
Right. Right. Well, and plus the thought, sometimes when you're doing the class, you don't want to sound dogmatic, like, oh, this is what happened. It's not a matter of salvation, but it's interesting to read the history part and then to read the letter. And like you say, yes, a lot of times when you go on a trip and then we relate that trip when we come back, we don't put every little emphasis on everything. But anyways, Paul now is in chapter 18, verse 5. Silas and Timothy have come to him. His time in Corinth is passing on. And they've come from Macedonia. So Paul is able now to take some time away from his tent making. And he gets back into the synagogues preaching. And he begins the epistles now to the Thessalonians. While teaching, as the case usually was with Paul, his preaching always caused an uproar with the Jews, didn't it? And he was about to encounter now, here in Corinth, his last uproar on the continent of Europe, the Jews. But this one is an interesting one, I thought, as I read it. The Jews hated Paul, and they're now at almost a boiling over point. And Paul knows it, and he is fearful for his well-being. And if you remember, the fact that the Lord appeared in a vision to Paul here in Corinth to comfort him helps us kind of understand the spirit that Paul was in. And we read on this occasion in verse 6 of chapter 18, "But when they resisted and blasphemed," this is the Jews, "he shook out his garments and said to them, 'Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles.'" Paul here now stops preaching and leaves the synagogue. In my words, he's done casting God's pearls before the swine. He's given up with these Jews. And even though Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed along with his household and many other Corinthians it really had no good effect on the rest of the Jews. They were beside themselves with anger. And now look at verse 12 of chapter 18. And we read now something that's interesting. Verse 12, chapter 18. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat. I had in the pictures that Jeremy gave me, I thought this was interesting. This is the judgment seat in Corinth. And this is where the rulers, the magistrates would sit up top the wall, and the people would be down below, and they would present their differences. But in verse 12 there we read now that here we are, Paul is below and brought before the judgment seat. Now, just like in Philippi and Thessalonica, the Jews have brought the same charge against Paul. But there is a little difference in this one, which showed me how arrogant sinful people can get. Their hatred begins to cloud their thinking. They drag Paul now before the judgment seat of Gallio. And if you look at chapter 16 of Acts, we're going to read what happened in that scene. We'll read verses 20 to 23 in chapter 16. And when they had brought him to the chief magistrates, they said, "These men are throwing our city into confusion, being Jews, and are proclaiming customs which are not lawful for us to accept or to observe, being Romans." Now look at verse 5 of chapter 17. We'll read there from 5 to verse 10. But the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men, this is the same scene, from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. And this is in Thessalonica, but the same idea. They're charging Paul here. They were seeking to bring them out to the people. When they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some brethren before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have upset the world have come here also." And Jason has welcomed them. And they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. They stirred up the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things. And when they had received a pledge from Jason and the others, they released them. And the brethren immediately sent, this is when Paul and Silas are sent away to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. But if you look closely, look at the charge now. Those were the charges in Philippi and Thessalonica. Okay, now you look at the charge in verse 13 of chapter 18. Here's the Jews before Gallio saying, speaking about Paul, "This man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." Not the Roman law, but their law. And they brought this charge before a Roman ruler, which I found very interesting, because here, whenever the Jews came before any magistrates, they always brought a charge that brought into sight the Roman law. Paul is speaking against Caesar. Paul is speaking against the Roman law. But here now, they're not doing that. They're bringing their own law up. They're before the Roman ruler, and they're saying, Paul is teaching against our law. But what I found interesting was that here they're dealing now with a man far different in character than from the magistrates of Philippi or the city rulers of Thessalonica. In Life and Epistles of Volume 1, I found something interesting. Gallio was a brother of a Roman moralist called Seneca. He was a famous Roman who described Gallio as a man of admirable integrity and likability. Instead, we see when the Jews come before him now, instead of yielding to them to keep peace, like all the other Roman magistrates, he examines the charge carefully, doesn't he? And seeing that it involves no infraction of the Roman law, he dismisses the case. He sends them away. He drives them away, actually, from the judgment seat, which I found interesting. And this is the only case in all the persecutions of Paul where his accusers are dealt with justly. And this reflected to me great credit upon Gallio. Now, whether the Greek public were favorable or unfavorable to Paul, we're not told. But when Gallio dismisses this case, the spectators were, I believe, highly gratified at the results. For once, really, the hearts of the unconverted public were with the apostle. And so indignant were they, and provoked at the attack on Paul, that when the verdict was given, they dragged, we're told, Synethus, and I believe he's the newly chosen chief of the synagogue, it seems, and they laid a beating on him. And Gallio, with the powers he had, should have stopped this riotous incident, but it seems he may have had a secret delight, if you will, in seeing the tables turned on the persecutors, when he should have really, with promptness, ended the scene. And I wonder, was this answer to Paul's prayer when the Lord came to him in the vision and told him not to worry? But the rage and the disappointment the Jews felt witnessing all this must have been intense by now. But they had no choice now, then, did they, but to be quiet. They weren't as sly, bringing their charge involving the Roman laws, which legally they lived under, but instead they arrogantly brought their own beliefs before Gallio. And this incident took place just previous to when Paul decides to go and leave Corinth.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord